A Game of Thrones by George R. Martin was released in 1996 and is the first book in the Song of Ice and Fire fantasy series. A Game of Thrones is many things, but what it ultimately boils down to is the story of two families that are all fighting for who will sit the Iron Throne, all while two exiled siblings attempt to make their return and take the throne for themselves. A Game of Thrones came at a very important time in my life because I had just finished high school and I was kind of falling out of love of reading, mostly due to the fact that I was reading books that I was forced to read throughout all of high school. But I remember getting both the first book and the first season and watching and reading those simultaneously with each other, and I will never forget that experience and how fun it was reading a new book while also watching the series it was based on and seeing how, they changed things or adapted the show. And I thought that was just a really enjoyable experience, and I just want to say that I love this book. It's ultimately responsible for getting me back into reading, and it was one of the best books that I had read in a long time that really got me into loving reading once again, and so it's always going to be near and dear to my heart. But anyway, let's get into the review. First off, I want to talk about Martin's writing style. Now, I've been going through YouTube at a bunch of booktuber reviews for A Game of Thrones, and there's a lot of people that have covered this book, and I've noticed a common criticism with quite a few of them is that Martin's writing style is hard to get into, very dry, and very difficult sometimes, and I just don't really have that problem at all. And I wondered if this was a common complaint with many people on why maybe they couldn't get into this series as they maybe could have gotten into the show, because I don't really have this problem, and in fact I find his writing style incredibly engaging, and it's what made me love this book to begin with. It's what made me read this humongous book was his writing style and his voice. Martin is able to really find a great balance between prose text and character dialogue, and depending on the situation that the chapter or scene calls for, he will have more prose text with more descriptions, he will have more dialogue-heavy scenes, but overall, he really strikes a balance by balancing these two out to where there's never more than the other throughout the entire novel, and so the novel feels really balanced, I feel. Also, if you read this book, you will know that Martin loves to describe a lot of things, especially food, locations, and even sometimes how people look and dress. And I find it all incredibly engaging to the fact that it really brings you into this world, because by the end of it, you know what everything looks like, you know what everything smells like. It's really amazing how he does his world building and how he is able to put you inside this world, and I thought that was incredibly engaging and really brought me into the story. Also, I like how he structures his story. Martin goes for a third-person limited perspective, so we focus on specific protagonists throughout the story, but we only see the world through their eyes and nobody else's. We see only what they see. And so that makes for some interesting stuff that goes on later on, and some really good tension, as certain characters know information that other characters do not. And so that is very tense when it comes to later parts of the book when, people have information that others don't, as I said. And that is really engaging to me, and I really liked what he was able to do by constructing the story in this way. And we cannot talk about this book without at least mentioning the characters. I love not only how Martin writes his protagonists, but how he writes his non-POV characters. They are all extremely engaging, interesting, and have their own flaws that I think really makes these characters feel very human. They have their own wants and needs, and they all end up in this morally gray area where none of them are neither good nor evil, and I thought that was a great way to make characters that felt extremely real. I don't think there's a single character in this book that isn't utilized to great effect. Every character, every chapter, every minute detail serves a purpose to the story. And when things really start going wrong for our characters, you really begin to feel for them and care for them. The story is something that I also really love. It's extremely engaging and highly original for a fantasy book, specifically because of what it is based on. Now, if you guys do not know, that Martin based the story of Game of Thrones off of the real historical event, the War of the Roses, which dealt with British nobles as they were fighting over who would rule Great Britain. And so that is very much what he does in this story, and I think it works to great effect, to the point that Game of Thrones really feels like a historical fantasy novel more than it does a true epic fantasy. In fact, I would say that this first book specifically is more low fantasy, and we don't get into the high fantasy elements of the series until we go later on into other books. So I would really say that the first book is really more of a mystery thriller novel that has its own trappings of what you expect in a fantasy series, such as epic battles, sword fights, and some mystical magical things along the way that are later on in the book. At this point, I think I'm going to go into a little bit of spoilers, mostly due to the fact that I think you cannot talk about this book without at least bringing up at least a couple of spoilers or some minor spoilers. So this is your spoiler warning. If you have not read A Game of Thrones, or if you have not watched the series, I say please do not watch this section. I do not want to be the person responsible for spoiling things for you. But anyway, just follow this time code for after the spoiler section is done. One of Game of Thrones' biggest themes has to do with the idea of honor and how far someone will go to maintain their honor, and that is extremely prevalent in the character of Eddard Stark, who is the most honorable character of this entire first book. In fact, he is definitely the main character of this book, and what happens to him later on in this book where he is killed for being so honorable, it's a very interesting idea for George R.R. Martin to do, and I think he executes it very well. And this is the part that people really talk about when they talk about this first book, as well as the first season of the television series, because it's so unexpected to see what is basically the main character of the first book to die at the very end. He doesn't have a heroic moment. He is beheaded because of the things that he reveals later on in the book. And it really shows that George R.R. Martin isn't doing this to just make a big twist at the end. He is truly making a statement. He is showing that, the typical fantasy protagonist cannot exist in the world that he has created. The world of Westeros is a dog-eat-dog world, and honorable men cannot exist in it because he does not play the Game of Thrones. And I thought that was extremely clever, and I think it really works for the story, and it really shows what George R.R. Martin is doing. And George R.R. Martin will continue to make these twists and turns later on in the series in greater effect, and he really shows that things can happen to people. Because you think about it, in our everyday life, terrible things happen to good people every day. And so A Game of Thrones really feels more real than most other fantasy stories. Now that we're done with the spoiler section, let's talk about things that I don't particularly like in this book, or things that at least fall a little flat for me. There's actually very few negatives I really have for this book, but if I had to pick some of them, one of the ones that I would pick is the fact that this is a grand, epic story, but it pales in comparison to the characters, and so the characters really outshine the story in a lot of ways because they are so extremely detailed, and the book is so much more character focused than plot focused that the plot kind of falls to the wayside as you're introduced to these amazing characters, and they really become the reason for reading the book. I also said before that every chapter and every character in the book really feels important to the overall story, but that doesn't mean that I love every character and every chapter in this book. In fact, there's a couple of chapters that I find myself just passively reading to try to get through so that I could get to the next great chapter. There's definitely a part where you really figure out who your favorite characters are and what your favorite chapters will be. And I'm looking at you, Catelyn Stark and Sansa Stark. Your chapters are really grating. They're extremely important for the overall story, but I could do without you. And so, that's a kind of complaint of mine. It's not going to be a complaint for everybody. And overall, there's still a reason to read those chapters, and they are important to the story. I might not like certain characters or chapters in this book, but overall, I don't think it really harms the enjoyment that I have reading this book at all. Another complaint I have with the book, and I've seen this mentioned by a lot of people, and I actually agree with them, is the fact that George R.R. Martin is not subtle when it comes to his writing. And I'm not talking about the extreme violence that is in the book either. I'm talking about things that he sets up as these sort of mysteries that he brings into the story that it's really obvious when you start reading this stuff. He's very on the point, on the nose when it comes to setting up these sort of mysteries or just these little tidbits here and there that are supposed to be this grand puzzle, but you can figure them out really easily. I'm talking about something like R plus L equals J. One read through of this book and you will know exactly what I mean. But in the end, I feel like those are just really minor complaints when it comes to the overall enjoyment of this story, because I think this is still a great book. At the end of the day, I love this book. I think it does a great job of setting up the rest of the series. I think it does a great job with its characters and world building, and it's an extremely interesting and unique take on the fantasy genre that is different from other things that we were getting at the time. Now, there are plenty of books that have probably come out since then that have replicated what Game of Thrones has done. This book is about 25 years old, but I still think that it is an important part of fantasy nonetheless. All in all, A Game of Thrones is a great book, and it's responsible for getting me back into reading. I love its characters and world and the way that the story builds to its ultimate conclusion. It's a very interesting read and an important story for the fantasy genre. I'm gonna give A Game of Thrones an 8 out of 10. I wholly recommend this book to anybody that is willing to pick it up. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and it might not be for everybody, because some people might just not be able to get into Martin's writing style, much like some people just cannot get into Tolkien's writing style, but it was absolutely perfect for me, and it worked. But I want to thank you guys for watching this review. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm actually currently reading A Dance with Dragons as we speak, and I thought this would be the perfect time to sit down and talk about the other books in the series leading up to me finishing that book. And I thought for every 200 pages I read of Dance, I would review a book in the series. So that's what I'm going to be doing here. So I'm going to be reviewing A Clash of Kings in a couple of weeks. Look forward to that review coming soon. Look forward to other reviews coming soon from me as well. But anyway, guys, as I said, thank you guys for watching once again, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next review.